For 13 years, Daniel Adimi lived with a pain that never completely disappeared. The day his wife Morenike gave birth to their daughter Deborah was supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives, but joy quickly turned into unimaginable sorrow when complications arose during delivery. Despite the doctor's desperate efforts to save her, Morenike passed away only moments after hearing her baby's first cry, leaving Daniel shattered and alone with a 2-year-old son named David and a newborn daughter who would grow up never knowing the warmth of her mother's embrace. At first, Daniel believed he would never survive the loss. Every room in the house reminded him of his wife, every family photograph reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal, and every milestone his children reached made him wish Morenike were there to witness it. Yet for the sake of his children, he forced himself to move forward. He learned how to braid Deborah's hair, attended parent-teacher conferences without fail, stayed up all night whenever either child became sick, and transformed himself into both father and mother because he refused to allow his children to feel deprived of love. As the years passed, David and Deborah became extremely attached to their father. He was their protector, their confidant, their biggest supporter, and the center of their entire world. David especially admired his father for remaining loyal to their mother's memory, while Deborah often boasted to her friends that her father loved them too much to ever allow another woman into their lives. Whenever relatives suggested that Daniel should remarry, David would quickly answer for him by saying that nobody could ever replace their mother, and Deborah would nod enthusiastically as if the matter had already been settled forever. Daniel himself had no interest in another relationship. Many women had crossed his path over the years. Some admired his kindness, others were attracted to his success as a respected architect, and a few simply saw a wealthy widower raising 2 children alone. However, none of them stirred anything inside him because his heart seemed to have frozen on the day Morenike died. Everything changed unexpectedly one rainy afternoon. Daniel had stopped at a small bookstore cafe after a difficult meeting because he wanted a few moments of peace before returning home. While searching through the shelves, he reached for a novel at the exact same moment another hand reached for it. Both of them withdrew their hands immediately and laughed awkwardly. The woman standing before him introduced herself as Grace Williams. She was a pediatric nurse at a nearby hospital, and within minutes their conversation flowed so naturally that Daniel completely lost track of time. They spoke about books, family, music, and even shared stories about the challenges of caring for children. For the first time in 13 years, Daniel felt something he thought he had buried forever. He felt seen. He felt understood. Most importantly, he felt alive. Their friendship gradually deepened over several months. Grace never pressured him, never competed with the memory of Morenike, and never acted as though she was trying to take anyone's place. She simply listened, encouraged him, and made him realize that grief and happiness could coexist within the same heart. Eventually Daniel introduced Grace to his mother, Mama Esther, who immediately noticed the change in her son. She had not seen him smile so freely in over a decade. "My son," she gently told him one evening, "you have mourned your wife faithfully for 13 years. You have honored her memory, raised her children beautifully, and sacrificed your own happiness for far too long. Loving someone again does not mean you have forgotten Morenike. It simply means that your heart has finally found the courage to heal." Daniel confessed that his greatest fear was not public opinion but the reaction of his children. Mama Esther sighed deeply before replying, "Children often mistake sharing love for losing love. They believe that if your heart expands to welcome someone else, there will somehow be less love available for them, but love does not work that way." Encouraged by his mother's wisdom, Daniel proposed to Grace, and she accepted with tears streaming down her cheeks. However, the evening Daniel announced his engagement to David and Deborah became one of the worst nights in the family's history. Deborah immediately burst into tears and accused her father of betraying their mother, while David stood up angrily and reminded Daniel that he had spent years teaching them that family loyalty mattered above everything else. Daniel tried explaining that nobody could ever replace Morenike and that Grace was not coming into their lives to erase anyone's memory, but the children refused to listen. David coldly informed his father that he was old enough to make his own decisions, but he should not expect them to welcome another woman into their home. Deborah declared that she would never call Grace her mother and stormed upstairs. Although Daniel hoped their feelings would soften over time, the children secretly made a pact. If Grace insisted on entering their lives, they would make sure she regretted it. The wedding ceremony was beautiful, but David and Deborah sat with expressionless faces throughout the celebration. They barely acknowledged Grace and refused to participate in family photographs. The real battle began the day Grace moved into the house. David intentionally ignored her greetings and spoke to her only when absolutely necessary. Deborah addressed her by her first name and never used respectful titles. They hid her belongings, tampered with her meals, deleted important contacts from her phone, and even blamed her whenever anything went missing. One afternoon, David loosened the screws of a dining chair hoping Grace would embarrass herself in front of visitors. The chair collapsed beneath her, but instead of becoming angry, Grace simply laughed and joked that years of working in emergency rooms had taught her how to fall gracefully. The children became increasingly frustrated because nothing seemed capable of provoking her. Whenever Deborah insulted her, Grace responded with patience. Whenever David disobeyed her, Grace remained calm. When they shouted that she was not their mother, Grace quietly admitted that she never intended to replace their mother and only hoped that one day they would allow her to become someone they could trust. Then fate intervened. Deborah attended a friend's birthday party one Saturday afternoon, and while returning home, the commercial bus she was traveling in collided with a truck. Several passengers sustained injuries, and Deborah became trapped between twisted metal seats. Daniel happened to be attending a conference in another city and could not arrive immediately, but Grace rushed to the accident scene as soon as she received the call. Ignoring warnings from bystanders, she climbed into the damaged vehicle and crawled through broken glass to reach Deborah. She covered the frightened teenager with her own body while rescuers worked tirelessly to free them. By the time emergency personnel managed to pull them out, Grace's arms were bleeding and her hands were badly cut. When Deborah regained consciousness at the hospital, she found Grace sitting beside her bed despite her own injuries. Confused and overwhelmed, Deborah asked why she would risk her life for someone who had treated her so cruelly. Grace smiled softly and answered that love is not always earned because sometimes people choose to love others simply because they belong to them. Deborah cried harder than she had cried in years. David also felt ashamed after learning what had happened, and both children sincerely apologized. Grace embraced them and forgave everything. Peace finally returned to the household, and for the first time since Morenike's death, Daniel felt his family becoming whole again. However, just when everyone believed their problems were over, a woman named Vivian unexpectedly appeared claiming that Grace had abandoned a husband many years earlier. She produced old photographs, legal documents, and even what appeared to be a marriage certificate. The revelation devastated the family. David accused Grace of deceiving them, while Daniel struggled to understand why she had hidden such an important secret. Through tears, Grace finally revealed that she had been forced into an abusive marriage after losing her parents as a teenager. She escaped after nearly being beaten to death and had begun divorce proceedings, but her husband disappeared before the process could be completed. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel hired investigators and discovered that Grace's former husband had actually died 5 years earlier and that Vivian had fabricated the entire scandal in hopes of extorting money from a wealthy family. Vivian was arrested, and the Adaimes stood firmly beside Grace, proving that she was no longer fighting life's battles alone. Several months later, Grace discovered she was pregnant, and the news transformed the atmosphere in the house completely. David painted the nursery, Deborah eagerly purchased baby clothes, Mama Esther danced around the living room singing praise songs, and Daniel thanked God for blessing him with another chance at happiness. 9 months later, Grace gave birth to a healthy baby boy, and as Daniel looked around the hospital room filled with smiling faces, he realized that his family had not replaced what they had lost. They had simply allowed love to grow large enough to welcome someone new. Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Make sure you check out our other stories on our YouTube channel.